January 3, 1946. Manila, the Philippines. A converted government building that still carries the smell of plaster dust and tropical decay. Outside, the city is rubble, entire blocks reduced to skeletal concrete frames by the battle that liberated it 11 months earlier. Inside, on a raised platform at one end of a long room, 5 American generals sit behind a wooden table. They are the judges. They wear pressed uniforms and stern faces, and the look of men who have already made up their minds about something, but have not yet said so out loud. Below them, in the dock, a Japanese lieutenant general named Masaharu Honma sits perfectly still with his hands folded in his lap. He is 58 years old. His hair is neatly combed. He wears a plain military tunic without decorations. He speaks fluent English, and he understands every word being said about him without waiting for his translator, though the translator is there, and the translating is slow, and the pauses between questions give Honma long seconds to sit with the weight of what is being asked. He is not the kind of man the American public expected to see in a war crimes doc. He spent 8 years as a military attaché in London. He was attached to the British Expeditionary Force in France during the First World War and was decorated with the Military Cross for gallantry. He met Winston Churchill at a diplomatic function. He met Mahatma Gandhi during a posting in India. He wrote poetry and was known by his own men as the Poet General. He once ordered his troops to treat Filipino civilians not as enemies but as friends. None of that matters now. What matters is the question that the 5 American generals are going to ask him, in different forms, over the next 5 weeks of testimony. The question is this: 650 Americans died on a 65-mile march that happened under his command in April of 1942. Thousands more died in the camp at the end of it. Thousands beyond that died in the years of captivity that followed. He was their captor. He was responsible for their lives under the laws of war that every civilized nation had agreed to observe. And his defense, the thing he will say from the witness stand with his voice cracking and his translator struggling to keep pace, is 4 words that will ring through the rest of this trial and through every war crimes proceeding that follows it for the next 80 years. I did not know. The prosecution does not believe him. The survivors of the march do not believe him. The press corps packed into the gallery does not believe him. General Douglas MacArthur, who convened this tribunal, personally selected its 5 judges, and will personally review its verdict, does not believe him. But the question this trial actually turns on is not whether Honma is telling the truth. The question is something harder, something the law had not fully worked out before this courtroom, and in many ways has not fully worked out since. The question is whether a general can be put to death for a crime he says he never saw, never ordered, and never learned about until it was too late to stop it, and whether the answer to that question depends on the evidence or on who is asking it. To understand what happened in that Manila courtroom, and why it still matters, we have to go back 4 years and 7,000 miles to a narrow peninsula on the western edge of the Philippine island of Luzon, where the largest surrender in American military history was about to take place, where an army of starving, disease-ridden men, abandoned by their own government and waiting for ships that had already been sunk, was about to lay down its weapons and walk into a catastrophe that their own War Department would spend 2 years trying to keep secret from the country that sent them there. There is something else you need to know before we go further. The Japanese command had a word for the prisoners they were about to receive. They called them horyo, which translates simply as prisoner, but in the Japanese military vocabulary of 1942, the word carried a weight that no English translation captures. Horyo was not a status. It was a condemnation. A horyo was a man who had chosen dishonor over death, and in the eyes of the Japanese soldier, that choice placed him beyond the protection of any law or convention. That contempt would walk alongside the prisoners for every one of the 65 miles between Mariveles and Camp O'Donnell. It would stand over them in the boxcars. It would meet them at the gate of the camp, and it would follow the survivors into the courtroom in Manila 4 years later, where the general who was supposed to have controlled it would sit in the dock and say he never knew it was there. The fall of Bataan did not begin on the day the Japanese landed. It began with a plan that should never have been approved and a promise that was never going to be kept. When war came to the Pacific on December 7, 1941, General Douglas MacArthur commanded the United States Army forces in the Far East from his headquarters in Manila. He had been given a mission by Washington: hold the Philippines, tie down the Japanese, buy time until the Navy could fight its way across the Pacific with reinforcements and relief. But that mission was built on a fleet that no longer existed. On December 7th, the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor and sank or crippled 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers. The Pacific Fleet, the fleet that was supposed to come to MacArthur's rescue, was burning in its own harbor. The reinforcements were never coming. Nobody told MacArthur that in so many words. Nobody told the 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers who would eventually crowd onto the Bataan Peninsula that the convoy they scanned the horizon for every morning was not delayed. It was not rerouted. It did not exist. The men fought anyway. They fought for 99 days. In the beginning they were on half rations, roughly 2,000 calories a day for men doing hard labor in jungle heat. By February, they were on quarter rations. By March, they were eating whatever they could kill or dig from the ground. They ate monkey, they ate carabao, the Philippine water buffalo, they ate iguana and snake, and a particular kind of jungle vine that tasted like nothing and provided almost no nutrition but filled the stomach for an hour. Some units ate tree bark, some ate grass. Officers lost 30 and 40 pounds. Enlisted men who had arrived in the Philippines weighing 180 pounds were down to 120 by the time the end came. The diseases were worse than the hunger. By late March 1942, an estimated 70% of the force was sick with malaria. The quinine supply had run out weeks earlier. Dysentery ripped through every unit, made worse by the fact that men too weak to walk to the latrine were soiling their foxholes and spreading the infection to the men beside them. Beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency, left men with swollen legs and failing hearts. Dengue fever blinded them temporarily. Night blindness from malnutrition made them unable to see after dark, which meant that the Japanese, who attacked frequently at night, could move through American positions almost at will. The men on Bataan were not defeated by the Japanese 14th Army. They were defeated by starvation, disease, and the knowledge, spreading through the ranks like the fever that was killing them, that no one was coming to save them. On March 11, 1942, MacArthur left. He boarded a patrol torpedo boat at the island fortress of Corregidor, under direct orders from President Franklin Roosevelt, ran the Japanese naval blockade in the dark, and escaped to Australia. He made the statement that would follow him for the rest of his life, and that would be carved into monuments and printed on posters, and repeated in newsreels across the United States. I shall return. The men on Bataan had a different way of putting it. They did not say it to reporters or into microphones. They said it to each other in foxholes and field hospitals and along the jungle trails where they were carrying their wounded on their backs because there were no more stretchers and the ambulances had been destroyed by Japanese artillery. The phrase became the unofficial motto of the Bataan garrison. We are the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward P. King, Jr., the commander of the Luzon force on Bataan, made the decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He surrendered. He did it against the explicit orders of both MacArthur, who was now in Australia, and Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, known to his men as Skinny Wainwright, for his gaunt 6'2" frame, who still held Corregidor and who had radioed King not to surrender under any circumstances. King disobeyed. He did it knowing it would end his career. He did it knowing history would judge him. He did it because the alternative was watching 10,000 more men die of disease and starvation over the next 2 weeks, while Japanese artillery shelled positions that no longer had the ammunition to shoot back. Before he signed the surrender document, he gathered his staff officers and said something that the men who heard it carried for the rest of their lives. You men remember this. You did not surrender. You had no alternative but to obey my order. He wanted them to know. If there was shame in this, it was his alone. He was taking it from them. Some of the men around King wept when they heard him say it. Others stood at rigid attention, refusing to show anything. A few officers broke their swords over their knees rather than hand them over. Enlisted men smashed the bolts of their rifles and threw the pieces into the jungle. One tank crew from the 192nd Tank Battalion drained the oil from their engine, ran it at full throttle until it seized, and then set it on fire. If the Japanese were going to take their equipment, they were going to take wreckage. Approximately 76,000 men, roughly 12,000 Americans, and 64,000 Filipinos laid down their weapons on the morning of April 9, 1942. It was the largest surrender in the history of the United States military, larger than the Civil War surrenders, larger than anything that had happened before or has happened since, and the men who laid down their arms that morning had no idea that the worst part of their war had not begun. The Japanese had planned for this surrender. That is an important thing to understand because it changes the moral weight of what followed. This was not a surprise. Lieutenant General Homer's headquarters had assigned a staff officer, Major General Yoshitake Kawane, to organize the transport and care of prisoners of war. Kawane drew up a logistics plan. There would be trucks to carry the weakest men. There would be field hospitals at intervals along the route. There would be rice and water at designated stopping points along a 65-mile road from the southern tip of Bataan to a former Philippine Army training base called Camp O'Donnell in Tarlac Province to the north. The plan was designed for 25,000 prisoners. 3 times that number showed up, and every one of them already sick, starving, and barely able to stand. The plan did not adjust. It collapsed. There were not enough trucks. There was not enough rice. The field hospitals existed on paper and nowhere else. The water stations were theoretical, and the Japanese soldiers assigned to guard the march were not rear echelon logistics troops who had been briefed on the Geneva Convention. They were frontline combat infantry who had just spent 99 days fighting in the same malaria-infested jungle, who had taken 7,000 dead and tens of thousands sick with the same diseases killing the Americans, and who had been raised from childhood in a military culture that contained one absolute and unshakable conviction about the men now stumbling past them in the dust. That conviction was the heart of Bushido as the Imperial Japanese Army interpreted it in 1942. A soldier who surrenders has forfeited his humanity. Surrender was not a tactical decision in the Japanese military code. It was a moral annihilation. A man who chose captivity over death had ceased to be a warrior and had become something less than an animal. Japanese soldiers were taught from basic training that they would die before they would surrender, and that any enemy who chose differently deserved whatever happened to him afterward. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention governing the treatment of prisoners of war. It had never ratified it. In February 1942, the Japanese government informed the International Committee of the Red Cross that it would observe the convention's terms with certain modifications. In practice, those modifications meant that the convention would be ignored entirely whenever it was inconvenient, which was always. What happened next, beginning on April 9th, and continuing for the next 5 to 10 days depending on where a man entered the column, has been known ever since as the Bataan Death March. The march began at 2 assembly points, Mariveles at the southern tip of Bataan and Bagac on the western coast. Prisoners were formed into groups of roughly 100 and marched north along the East Coast Road towards San Fernando, a rail junction approximately 40 miles up the peninsula. From there they would be crammed into boxcars for a train ride to the town of Capas, and then marched a final 7 to 9 miles to Camp O'Donnell. The total distance was approximately 65 miles. The men who started walking that morning were already half dead. They had been starving for weeks or months. Most were racked with malaria. Many could barely stand. They had no canteens. They had no food. They had no hats against the April sun, which in the Philippines is the hottest month of the year. And within the first mile, the killing started. The first thing that happened was the shakedown. Japanese guards moved down the columns taking everything: watches, rings, wallets, photographs of wives and children, cigarette lighters, canteens, anything of value, and anything with no value at all. Any prisoner found carrying Japanese currency, or a Japanese souvenir, anything that might have been taken from a dead Japanese soldier, was pulled from the column. Lieutenant Kermit Lay, a survivor, described watching a man dragged behind a rice shack because a guard found a few Japanese coins in his pocket. There was a single rifle shot. The guard returned alone. Other men were taken to the side of the road and beheaded with an officer's sword. The men in the column kept walking. They had no choice. The column did not stop for death. It barely paused. Then the sun did its work. Temperatures on the road exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit day after day. The Japanese used a method the survivors named the sun treatment. At collection points along the route, prisoners were forced to sit in direct sunlight, without head cover, without water, without shade, for hours. Men who had been weakened by months of starvation and racked by malarial fevers went mad in the heat. They had seizures, they slipped into delirium, they fell into comas, and when the column moved on and they could not stand, they were left for what followed behind. What followed behind were the buzzard squads. That is what the survivors called the cleanup details assigned to the rear of each column. Japanese soldiers with fixed bayonets and a standing order. Any man who falls and cannot get up is to be killed. The method varied. Some stragglers were shot, some were bayoneted where they lay, some were beaten to death with rifle butts. Some, according to sworn testimony given at the Homer trial, were buried alive. Survivors described watching Japanese guards order prisoner work details to shovel dirt over men who were still moving, still trying to lift an arm, still breathing when the earth covered their faces. And then there was the water. This is the detail that survivors, decades after the war, could not speak about without their voices failing. The road from Mariveles to San Fernando passed dozens of artesian wells. Clean water flowed freely from the ground along the sides of the road. Clear, cold water bubbling up through the earth within arm's reach of the column. The prisoners were forbidden to drink. Men who had been without water for a full day, who were marching in 100-degree heat with dysentery and malarial fever, could see clean water 10 feet from the road and were told they would be killed if they stepped out of line to reach it. Some men broke ranks and ran for the wells anyway. A survivor testified that men went stark raving mad and soldiers broke ranks and charged toward the water, and that they were shot or bayoneted before they could cup it in their hands. The men who stayed in the column drank from roadside ditches. They scooped brown water that was contaminated with human waste, with agricultural runoff, and with the fluids from the bodies of men who had been killed and left in those same ditches hours earlier. The ditch water brought cholera. It accelerated the dysentery. It killed men who might have survived the march if someone had simply let them drink from the wells that were flowing freely 10 feet from where they walked. There is a moment along the march that has been recorded in multiple survivor accounts and that captures the particular cruelty of what was being done. At a point along the road near the town of Lubao, a group of Filipino women gathered at the roadside with buckets of water and balls of cooked rice, trying to hand them to the prisoners as they passed. Japanese guards drove the women back with bayonets. When several women persisted, crawling under the guards' reach to push rice balls into the hands of prisoners who were stumbling past, the guards began striking the women with rifle butts. One survivor recalled that a Filipino woman was bayoneted in the arm as she reached out to hand a canteen to a prisoner. She fell back but did not leave. She stayed at the roadside, bleeding, holding out the canteen with her other hand until the column had passed. The Filipino people along the route of the march risked their lives to help the prisoners. They slipped water to men in the column when the guards were not watching. They hid men who fell out of the line and nursed them in their houses until the Japanese patrols moved on. They paid for this with beatings, and in some cases with their lives. The story of the Bataan Death March is also the story of ordinary Filipino civilians who chose to show mercy at a cost that the men who received it never forgot. Between April 9th and April 12th, near the Pantingan River, at the base of Mount Samat, something happened that goes beyond the march itself. Approximately 350 to 400 Filipino officers and non-commissioned officers were separated from the main column. They came from the 1st, 11th, 71st and 91st Divisions of the Philippine Army. They were bound together with telephone wire. They were taken to the riverbank, and over the course of several hours, they were massacred, shot, bayoneted, beheaded, and clubbed to death in groups. The order for this slaughter did not come from General Homer. It came from Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a fanatical staff officer who operated through a Japanese military tradition called Gekokujo, which means insubordination from below, the practice of junior officers issuing unauthorized orders in the name of a superior. Tsuji gave the kill order using Honma's authority without Honma's knowledge. What makes this even more unbearable to think about is that not every Japanese officer obeyed. Colonel Takeo Imai, a regimental commander in the same brigade, received the same verbal order from Tsuji's network. He demanded it in writing. He never got it. So he released approximately 1,000 prisoners into the jungle and let them go. One officer demanded a piece of paper and saved 1,000 men. Another officer accepted a spoken word and helped butcher 400. The distance between those two decisions was nothing more than one man's refusal to kill without written authorization. That refusal saved 1,000 lives. A survivor of the Pantingan River massacre, a Filipino lieutenant named Manuel Yan, lived to bear witness. He would later become the commanding general of the Philippine Army and serve as his nation's ambassador. He carried that river with him until the day he died. At San Fernando, roughly 40 miles into the march, the prisoners were loaded into railroad boxcars for the next phase of the journey. The cars were narrow gauge, relics of the First World War era, designed to carry 40 men or 8 horses. The Japanese packed approximately 100 men into each car and sealed the doors. Staff Sergeant Alf Larson described it. They packed us in the cars like sardines, so tight you could not sit down. Then they shut the door. If you passed out, you could not fall down. People died in the railroad cars. The sealed steel cars sat in the tropical sun. The temperature inside rose past 130 degrees. There was no ventilation. There was no water. Men suffocated standing up. Men died of heat stroke without ever falling, their bodies held upright by the pressure of the living men crushed against them on every side. When the doors were finally opened at the rail terminus of Capas, the living and the dead tumbled out together onto the platform. From Capas, the survivors walked a final 7 to 9 miles to Camp O'Donnell. What they found was not a camp in any meaningful sense. It was an unfinished Philippine Army training facility, a collection of wooden barracks and open ground, with almost no running water, no sanitation, and no medical supplies. The men had walked 65 miles through hell to reach a place where the dying was about to get worse. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, in any branch, in any theater, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit were they with? Where did they serve? What did they carry home with them? The things they told and the things they never spoke about. Those details, the personal ones that never made it into the archives, are the real record of what happened. They deserve to be preserved by the families who hold them. Camp O'Donnell was designed to hold roughly 10,000 men. By mid-April 1942, it held nearly 60,000. The water system consisted of a single functioning spigot that took approximately 15 minutes to fill one canteen. Men stood in line for hours. Many collapsed before they reached the front. Some died waiting. The latrines were open slit trenches that overflowed within days and became breeding grounds for every disease the men had brought with them from the march. The daily ration was a single serving of rice, often contaminated with insects, never enough to sustain a man who was already malnourished and fighting off infection. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, diphtheria, and pneumonia moved through the camp like weather. There was almost nothing the camp's few surviving American doctors could do. They had no medicines. They had no surgical instruments. They had nothing except their hands and their knowledge, and the terrible helplessness of watching men die of diseases that a bottle of quinine or a course of sulfur drugs could have cured. The death rate climbed week after week. By the end of May 1942, 44 Americans were dying every day inside Camp O'Donnell. On May 29th, 50 Americans died in a single 24-hour period, the worst single-day toll in the camp's records. The bodies were carried to mass graves dug by prisoner details who were themselves dying. The graves were shallow because the men digging them no longer had the strength to go deeper. By the time Camp O'Donnell was closed in January 1943, approximately 1,500 Americans had died within its barbed wire. The Filipino death toll was catastrophically higher. Roughly 26,000 Filipino soldiers died at O'Donnell, more than half of all the Filipino prisoners held there. The American survivors were transferred to a second camp at Cabanatuan, where conditions improved slightly but where death continued. The Cabanatuan Memorial lists 2,656 American dead. The numbers require honesty, because honesty is the only thing the dead are owed. The precise death toll of the Bataan Death March will never be known. The Japanese kept no records of prisoner deaths on the road. An unknown number of men escaped into the jungle during the march, with the help of Filipino civilians who pulled them from the column at great risk to their own lives. Post-war estimates by survivors were sometimes inflated by the weight of years of trauma. What the verified sources tell us is this: approximately 76,000 men began the march. The United States Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that roughly 650 Americans died on the march itself. Historian Stanley Falk, who painstakingly reconstructed the toll from surviving personnel records, arrived at a range of 500 to 650 American dead on the march, with between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipinos killed on the road. These are estimates. The real number is buried in the unmarked graves along the highway from Mariveles to San Fernando. For nearly 2 years after the march, the American public knew almost nothing about what had happened to its sons. The reason for the silence, and the reason the silence eventually broke, both center on one man. His name was Captain William Edwin Dyess, and he was a 25-year-old fighter pilot from Albany, Texas, who flew a P-40 in the doomed air defense of Bataan. When the peninsula fell, Dyess refused evacuation. He surrendered with his unit, survived the death march, and endured months of captivity at Camp O'Donnell, then Cabanatuan, and finally the Davao Penal Colony on the southern island of Mindanao. On April 4, 1943, nearly a year after the fall of Bataan, Dyess led a group of 10 American prisoners in the only large-scale Allied escape from Japanese captivity in the entire Pacific War. The group included Major Jack Hawkins, Major Austin Schofner, Lieutenant Sam Gracchio, Commander Melvin McCoy, and Major Stephen Melnick. They broke through the jungle, evaded Japanese patrols, linked up with American guerrilla forces operating under Colonel Wendell Fertig on Mindanao, and were evacuated by submarine. When Dyess reached the United States, he was debriefed by military intelligence and dictated a comprehensive account of the death march and the camps to a Chicago Tribune reporter named Charles Lavelle. It was the most detailed eyewitness record of the Bataan atrocities any American official had ever read. The War Department classified it and ordered it suppressed. The official reason was concern for the safety of the remaining prisoners. The fear was that publication would provoke Japanese reprisals. The unofficial reason was more complicated and less noble. The story of Bataan was a story of American defeat, of promises broken and men abandoned, and the War Department was in no hurry to remind the public of that while the war was still being fought. The suppression held for months. Then on December 22, 1943, Dyess was killed in a P-38 training crash near Burbank, California. He was on a training flight in his P-38 when an engine caught fire over a residential area in Burbank. He could have bailed out and saved himself. Instead, he stayed with the aircraft and steered it into a vacant lot to avoid killing civilians on the ground. He was 27 years old. With Dyess dead, and the Tribune threatening to publish the account regardless of War Department objections, the government released the story. It ran beginning January 28, 1944, serialized in more than 100 newspapers across the country. It was called the biggest story of the war since Pearl Harbor. The American public learned for the first time the full scope of what had been done to its soldiers. Enlistment centers reported an immediate surge in volunteers. The war in the Pacific, which had been a distant and secondary theater for many Americans focused on Europe, suddenly had faces and names and a crime that demanded an answer. Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas, is named for him. He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant colonel. What the American public did not learn from the Dyess account, because the account was focused on his personal experience, was the scope of the system that produced the march. The Bataan Death March was not an isolated atrocity. It was the product of a military culture that had already committed comparable crimes in China, in Malaya, in Singapore, and in the Dutch East Indies. The rape of Nanking in 1937, the Suk Ching massacre in Singapore in February 1942, the forced labor of the Burma Railway, which would kill approximately 12,000 Allied prisoners of war over the next 2 years. The Japanese military by 1942 had developed an institutional indifference to the suffering of prisoners and civilians that was not an aberration, but a pattern, and the pattern originated not from individual cruelty, though there was plenty of that, but from a command culture that defined mercy toward the defeated as weakness and weakness as treachery. The men who guarded the Bataan Death March were not uniquely sadistic. They were the products of a system that had trained the capacity for mercy out of them and replaced it with a single imperative: the prisoner is beneath you, act accordingly. The question that had been burning since January 1944, the question the entire country wanted answered, was the same question the 5 generals in that Manila courtroom were now putting to the man in the dock in January of 1946. Who was responsible? The prosecution's answer was simple: Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma. He commanded the 14th Army. The march took place under his authority. The camp operated under his jurisdiction. Hundreds of Americans died on a road his headquarters could see from its windows. Therefore he was guilty, not because he ordered the atrocities, not even because he knew about them, but because he should have known. He had a duty to know. He had a responsibility, under the laws of war and under his own oath as a commanding officer, to ensure the safety of prisoners in his custody. The legal theory was called command responsibility. It had never been applied quite this way before. The prosecution called witness after witness. Men who had survived the march took the stand and described what they had seen and what had been done to them. The testimony went on for days. Master Sergeant James Baldassare of Brooklyn described the killings of Allied officers and testified that he had seen Homma personally riding in an official car along the march route, placing the commanding general at the scene of the atrocities. Outside the courtroom, Baldassare told reporters exactly what he thought the verdict should be, in language that required no interpretation. The defense team was 6 military lawyers, none of whom had criminal trial experience. The lead attorney was Major John H. Skeen Jr., a 27-year-old Admiralty lawyer from Baltimore. He had never tried a capital case. He had never tried any case in front of a jury. He had been assigned to defend a man's life against charges carrying the death penalty approximately 2 weeks before the trial began. He was operating in a courtroom where the outcome had, in the view of many legal observers at the time, already been decided before the first witness was sworn. Skeen and his team did their best with what they had. They called witnesses who testified that Homma had ordered prisoners treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They presented evidence that Homma had personally made 10 separate requests to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo for food supplies for the prisoners, asking for 100,000 tons of rice and receiving approximately 1/30th of that amount. They demonstrated that Homma had replaced the commander of Camp O'Donnell when reports of conditions reached him and had ordered improvements to the water supply, sanitation, and burial procedures at the camp. They argued that Homma had delegated all prisoner logistics to General Kawane and had been consumed with planning the assault on the island fortress of Corregidor, which began less than a month after the Bataan surrender. On February 4, 1946, Homma himself took the stand. He testified for 3 days. He told the tribunal that he had not learned the full scale of the death toll until roughly 2 months after the march, and that he had not grasped its true horror until after the war ended. He admitted traveling along the march route, but said his memory on the point was somewhat obscure. When asked about the hundreds of bodies that witnesses had testified were visible along the road, he said he was not looking for them particularly. Then, during a recess, he passed a handwritten note to his defense attorney, Lieutenant Robert Pells. It said, "I am horrified to learn these things happened under my command. I am ashamed of our troops." Pells wrote in his private diary that evening that Homma was becoming a broken man. He added, "I truly believe he had no idea of the things that had occurred." On February 11, 1946, after more than 5 weeks of testimony, the 5 generals returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by firing squad, not hanging. The distinction was deliberate. Death by firing squad was considered the honorable military execution. It was the only leniency the tribunal extended. Homma's wife, Fujiko, traveled to Manila and personally appealed to MacArthur for clemency. MacArthur refused. He wrote in his formal review of the sentence, "If this defendant does not deserve his judicial fate, none in jurisdictional history ever did." The case reached the United States Supreme Court, which declined to intervene, but Justice Frank Murphy wrote a dissent that has been cited in international law for 80 years. He wrote that the proceedings risked descending to the level of revengeful blood purges. He warned that executing a commander for the crimes of his subordinates without evidence that the commander ordered or knew of those crimes was a precedent that would haunt military justice for generations. He was right. Brigadier General Arthur Trudeau, one of the 5 judges who convicted Homer, said in a 1971 interview that he had opposed the verdict. He called Homer an outstanding soldier. Chief Defense Counsel Skeen, looking back years later, called it a highly irregular trial conducted in an atmosphere that left no doubt as to what the ultimate outcome would be. There is a question that must be asked about this tribunal, and it is not a comfortable question to ask. MacArthur convened the trial. MacArthur selected the judges. MacArthur reviewed the verdict. MacArthur denied clemency. Homer had defeated MacArthur. Homer's 14th Army had driven MacArthur from the Philippines, had forced the surrender of MacArthur's entire command, and had turned MacArthur's departure into one of the most scrutinized decisions of the entire war. The trial was held in the same city where Homer had accepted the American surrender 4 years earlier. The defense was given 2 weeks to prepare against a prosecution that had been building its case for months. None of this proves the verdict was unjust. The men who died on that road deserved an accounting. Homer bore responsibility as the commanding officer by any reasonable legal standard. But Justice Murphy's warning about the difference between justice and vengeance is difficult to read today without hearing its echo. The doctrine of command responsibility that this trial established has since been applied at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and at the International Criminal Court. Generals, ministers, and heads of state have been convicted under the principle that a commander who fails to prevent or punish crimes committed by his subordinates is himself guilty of those crimes. The precedent began in this room, in this trial, with this man. Whether that precedent was born of justice or of vengeance is a question that legal scholars continue to debate. What is beyond debate is that the men who died on the road from Mariveles to San Fernando, the Americans and the Filipinos who fell on that highway, are the reason the principle exists. Their deaths are written into the architecture of international law, even if their names are not. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. It keeps names visible that would otherwise fade into the silence of the archives. That matters more than any algorithm. On the night of April 2nd, 1946, Homer was transferred to a detention facility near the town of Los Baños, south of Manila. He was given a last meal. He drank beer with his chaplain and his guards. He was calm in a way that unsettled the men watching him. At one point during the evening, he raised his glass and said something that has been recorded in multiple accounts of that night. He said, "Please congratulate me on the start of a new life." Then, in a moment that seems to belong to a different conversation entirely, he asked a question that no one in the room answered. He asked who was responsible for Hiroshima. Shortly after 1 in the morning on April 3rd, 1946, Homer was led to a courtyard. He was hooded. He was tied to a wooden post with a white cloth pinned over his heart. A firing squad of 12 men took their positions. 4 of the 12 rifles had been loaded with blank rounds, so that no individual soldier would carry the certainty of having fired the killing shot. The order was given. Homer fell. The men who survived the march were not finished suffering. For many of them, the march and the camps were only the prelude to something worse. Beginning in 1942 and continuing through 1944, surviving American prisoners were loaded aboard unmarked transport ships, rusting freighters with no Red Cross markings, no ventilation in the cargo holds, and no sanitation. The prisoners named them the Hell Ships. They were being shipped to Japan, Formosa, Manchuria, and Korea to serve as slave labor in coal mines, steel mills, and construction projects. Because the ships carried no prisoner of war markings, they were indistinguishable from Japanese military transports. American submarines and carrier aircraft attacked them repeatedly. The results were among the worst disasters of the war. The Orisan Maru was torpedoed by an American submarine in October 1944. Approximately 1,780 American prisoners of war drowned or were killed in the attack. It remains the single worst loss of American life at sea. The Oryoku Maru left Manila in December 1944 with more than 1,600 prisoners packed into its holds. It was bombed by American aircraft on December 14th. Survivors were transferred to the Anura Maru and then the Brazil Maru. Of the original 1,600 men who boarded the Oryoku Maru, only approximately 264 were alive when the war ended. The men who had survived the march and the camps were being killed by their own navy and their own air force. There was no way for either side to stop it. There is a detail about the hell ships that needs to be stated plainly because it captures something that statistics cannot. In the holds of these ships, where men were packed so tightly they could not lie down, where the heat exceeded 140 degrees, where dysentery made the floor slick with human waste, men went insane. They attacked each other in the darkness. They killed each other over canteens. They drank the blood of dead men because there was no water. When the hatches were opened after several days at sea, the Japanese guards sometimes lowered buckets of rice into the hold and watched the prisoners fight over them. The men who had survived the march, who had survived the camps, who had kept their sanity and their humanity through years of captivity, lost both in those holds. The hell ships broke men that the death march had not, and when American bombs struck the ships, the prisoners trapped below decks had no chance. They died in water that was pouring through the hull, in fire from exploding ordnance, and in the crush of men trying to reach the hatchways. The ones who made it topside found themselves in the open sea, swimming through oil and debris, shot at by Japanese guards on the deck, and strafed by American aircraft that had no way of knowing who was in the water below them. On January 30th, 1945, the United States Army mounted one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of the Pacific War. The Sixth Ranger Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, together with Alamo Scouts and Filipino guerrilla forces, led by Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Choson, advanced 30 miles behind Japanese lines to the Cabanatuan prison camp. They were driven by intelligence that the Japanese were preparing to execute the remaining prisoners, and that fear was not hypothetical. 6 weeks earlier, on December 14, 1944, Japanese guards at a camp on the island of Palawan had herded approximately 150 American prisoners into air raid shelters, doused them with gasoline, and set them on fire. The men who tried to escape the burning shelters were machine-gunned. 11 men survived by scrambling over the sea cliffs and swimming to safety in the water below. The Palawan massacre was the reason the Cabanatuan raid could not wait another day. At Cabanatuan, the Rangers struck at dusk. Captain Pajota's guerrillas had set up a roadblock on the highway to block any Japanese reinforcements from the nearby garrison town, and in the fighting that followed, Pajota's men held off an entire Japanese battalion attempting to reach the camp. In a 30-minute firefight, they overwhelmed the Japanese garrison and freed 511 American prisoners of war. Many of the liberated men were too weak to walk and were carried out on the backs of the Rangers and the Filipino guerrillas who had guided them in. Some of the prisoners did not understand at first what was happening. They had been captive for nearly 3 years. They had stopped believing rescue was possible. When the Rangers came through the gates, some of the men simply stood where they were and wept. Of the roughly 22,000 Americans captured on Bataan, approximately 15,000 came home, 7,000 did not. The full scale of what Japanese captivity meant for American prisoners is captured in a single comparison compiled by the Department of Veterans Affairs through the research of Dr. Charles Stenger. Of the 27,465 Americans captured and interned by Japan during the entire war, 11,107 died. That is a death rate exceeding 40%. By contrast, of the 93,941 Americans held by Germany, 1,121 died, a rate of just over 1%. An American prisoner of war in Japanese hands was roughly 40 times more likely to die than an American prisoner in German hands. That is not a statistic. It is an indictment of an entire system. It means that for every 10 Americans taken prisoner by Japan, 4 did not survive to see the end of the war. They died of starvation, disease, execution, forced labor, drowning, and in the cruelest category of all, the bombs and torpedoes of their own countrymen who were trying to save them. No other combatant nation in the Second World War produced a prisoner of war death rate remotely comparable. The Japanese system did not merely fail to protect its prisoners, it consumed them. So here is the answer to the question the 5 generals asked in that Manila courtroom. Who was responsible for the 650 Americans who died on the march? Homer was responsible under the doctrine of command responsibility, a legal theory that this trial helped establish and that has since become the foundation of international military law. But Homer was not the only answer, and he may not even have been the most important one. Colonel Tsuji was responsible, the man who issued kill orders in a general's name, without the general's knowledge, who orchestrated the Pantingan River massacre, and who escaped all prosecution by fleeing to Thailand at the war's end. He returned to Japan after the occupation, ran for public office, and was elected to the Japanese parliament. He was never tried. He was never punished. He sat in the Japanese parliament while the families of the men he had ordered killed were still searching for their remains in the Philippine jungle. He disappeared in Laos in 1961 and was eventually declared legally dead. The man who bore more direct responsibility for specific killings on the march than anyone else in the Japanese chain of command lived free for 15 years after the war, while the general he had undermined was shot by a firing squad. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo bore responsibility for building a military culture that regarded surrender as a moral crime and prisoners as subhuman. The individual guards on the road bore responsibility, the men who bayoneted prisoners for reaching toward a well, who buried men alive in drainage ditches, who used their officers' swords on men too weak to stand. And in a broader and more uncomfortable sense, the decisions made in Washington were part of the answer too, the decisions that sent an army to the Philippines with promises of reinforcement that were already lies, that left tens of thousands of men to starve on a peninsula with no hope of rescue, and that suppressed the truth about what happened to them for 2 years because the truth was inconvenient. Lester Tenney survived the march. He was a sergeant in the 192nd Tank Battalion. He survived Camp O'Donnell. He survived a hell ship. He survived 3 years as a slave laborer in a coal mine near Nagasaki. He came home weighing 97 pounds. He spent the next 60 years of his life asking the Japanese government for an apology. He described the march in words that need no embellishment. If you stopped walking, you died. If you had to defecate, you died. If you had a malaria attack, you died. Either they cut your head off, they shot you, or they bayoneted you. But you died if you fell down. He wrote a book about his captivity called My Hitch in Hell, and spent decades writing letters, filing legal claims, and speaking at public events demanding acknowledgement from the Japanese government of what had been done to him and to the men who did not come home. He received his apology on September 13, 2010, 68 years after the march, when Japanese Foreign Minister Katsuya Okada formally apologized to 6 former American prisoners of war, including Tenney. Ben Steele survived the march. He was an Army Air Corps private from Montana, a ranch boy who had never been further from home than the next county before the war sent him to the other side of the world. He survived Camp O'Donnell. He survived Cabanatuan. He survived a hell ship. After the war, he became an artist. He spent the rest of his life drawing and painting what he had witnessed on the road from Mariveles. His sketches, rendered in pencil and charcoal, are among the most important visual records of the march. They show what photographs could not have captured. A man drinking from a roadside ditch, a man being struck with the butt of a rifle, a row of bodies along a dusty road in the Philippine sun, the face of a man standing in a boxcar who has just realized that the body pressed against him is no longer breathing. Steele never stopped drawing. He was still producing work about the march well into his 90s, because he believed the men he had walked beside deserved a witness who would not look away. Abie Abraham survived the march. He was a master sergeant in the 31st Infantry Regiment. After liberation, he volunteered to stay behind in the Philippines on a graves registration detail. His assignment was to walk the route of the death march with a shovel and a notebook, exhuming the dead from shallow roadside graves, trying to identify them by dog tags, dental records, or the scraps of uniform still attached to their remains. He testified at the Homer trial, that he had already recovered 300 bodies and expected to find hundreds more. After the war, he wrote a book about it. He called it Ghost of Bataan Speaks. The Defense Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Accounting Agency continues to search for and identify remains from the march and the camps. More than 80 years later, they are still finding them. They are still bringing them home. Homer's note said, "I am horrified." Whether he was telling the truth is a question that went with him to that courtyard at Los Banos. What did not go with him is the record. The names of the men who walked that road exist in the archives. Their testimony fills the trial transcripts. Their memories live in the letters they finally wrote home after liberation, and in the silences they kept for the rest of their lives about the things they could not put into words. Most of them were young when they were captured. Most of them were drafted. They had been farmers and factory hands and truck drivers and store clerks before the war reached across the Pacific and pulled them into something none of them had ever imagined. They walked because the man beside them was still walking. They kept going because stopping meant leaving that man alone on a road where no one who fell was ever picked up again. They endured because something in them, something no tribunal ever examined and no commanding general ever explained, would not let them stop while there was still one more step they could take. 650 of them did not reach the end of the road. They fell on a highway in a country most of them could not have found on a map before 1941. They were buried in graves so shallow that the monsoon rains uncovered them. Their names are recorded on memorial walls and in government databases and in the quiet rooms of families who have kept those names alive for more than 80 years. This is their record, not the general's defense, not the tribunal's verdict, not the legal argument over a commander's duty to know that scholars have refined ever since. Their record is simpler and harder to argue with. They were sent somewhere they did not choose. They fought as long as they could. They surrendered when a general told them there was no alternative. And then they walked, mile after mile, in heat that cracked the road and thirst that cracked their minds, because the only other option was to lie down and let the buzzard squad find them. The ones who made it carried the ones who did not for the rest of their lives. That is the true verdict, the one no courtroom could deliver and no appeal could overturn. If this investigation gave you something you did not have before, hit that like button. It helps this work reach the people who want the history told the way it happened, with the names, the facts, the testimony, and the questions that the courtroom left open. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are more of these stories waiting, and most of them belong to men who never expected to be remembered and who deserve to be.